All right, we're going to talk briefly now about research ethics and psychology and look at how we can be sure that research is done in an ethical manner to assure both the comfort and safety of the research participants, as well as to maximize your chances of good results. So, how do we assure that research is done ethically? In the early days, people like Bunt, Watson, even up until about the 1950s, there were relatively few restrictions on psychology researchers, other than the basic common sense uh, behave in conduct becoming a university professor. Obviously, if people had problems with what you were doing, they would complain to the university, and the university would handle it. But it was all done internally. There were no national standards. And unfortunately, during that period, there were some examples of ethically questionable studies. Now, it's interesting, some of these are some of the most important studies in psychology that we talk about a lot, but it's not clear that they would get through modern ethics committees. One example, 1920. John B. Watson and his student Rosalie Rayner. Remember Watson as the founder of the behaviorist movement. He was interested in fear conditioning. And so what Watson and Rayner did is they took a little boy named Albert. They gave him a white laboratory rat to play with, a nice tame rat, which he liked very much and would pet it and let it crawl in his lap. He had no fear of the rat. And then what they decided to do was to pair the rat with something that would scare him. And what scared the baby was a loud noise. So they would give him the rat, and when he reached for it, Watson would strike a piece of metal with an iron bar, make a big loud clang, which would startle the baby, scare him, he'd start to cry. Now his mother was there and would pick him up and comfort him, but they were, in fact, intentionally scaring this baby. Well, what happened over a period of a few sessions, about 7 such pairings, Albert became afraid of the rat. And so this rat that he had enjoyed previously, now when he saw it, he would recoil from it, try to get away from it. Now the plan for Watson and Rayner had been to then counter condition him. They had planned to try to get him over this fear of the rat that they had now created. But little Albert's mother removed him from the study, stopped bringing him back to the lab, and so little Albert, as far as they knew, left the lab with this fear of white rats. And in fact, they had tested his fear had generalized to other white furry things, like a roll of cotton or a sealskin coat. So for all they knew, they left this 18-month-old baby with a long-term fear of white fuzzy objects. It's not known exactly what happened to little Albert after that study, or how long that fear lasted, or whether he suffered any long-term effects. Another example, Stanley Milgram's famous study in 1961. This was a study, this is in, of course, the post-World War II era. It was a study done because people were wanting to understand how it was Nazi Germany had persuaded a lot of ordinary citizens to go along with this horrible thing that was the Holocaust, the extermination of so many people. And so the study Milgram did in his lab at Yale, he brought people into the lab, told them they were participating in a teaching exercise where one of them would be assigned to be the teacher, one of them would be assigned to be the student, and they would ask a series of questions. And every time the student got something wrong, the teacher was supposed to administer a shock to them. Now the shocks started at a very low, just a mildly painful level, but not dangerous level. But according to the machine, they increased in frequency each time with every mistake, and eventually got up to a level that was very high and was actually labeled on the machine as very dangerous, several hundred volts. Now, in reality, no shocks were being administered. but the person who was doing the quote-unquote teaching did not know that. So during the course of the study, they were asked to do what they thought was administering stronger and stronger shocks to another person. Now, the other person was in the other room. They would be able to hear them. They would be able to hear them screaming, asking to be let out, saying, I've got a heart condition. I think I'm going to have a heart attack. And eventually, if the person kept on with the study, they would go silent, as if they had lost consciousness, or worse, possibly even died in there. And many of these people would question the experimenter, say, hey, we really should be doing that? Shouldn't we check on their safety, et cetera, et cetera? But the reality of it is that about 60 to 70% of these people continued the full experiment, and even up to the level of what they thought were very, very dangerous shocks that could have killed the person. And were they being pressured to do this? Well, the experimenter was simply telling them very calmly, it is necessary for you to continue. Please continue the study. They were not threatening them. They were not threatening their job, their livelihood. All the person had to do was walk away. Yet most of them did it. So this was a pretty important study. In fact, it's very often listed as one of the most important studies in the history of psychology, but it no doubt caused a lot of stress to these people. And as years went on, people had become extremely concerned. Was there any long-term harm to these research participants by telling them or having them believe, even for a short time, that they had possibly killed someone as part of a psychology study. So, in the later half of the 20th century, the APA came up with a series of ethical guidelines. The APA, in fact, has ethical guidelines governing all parts of psychology, applied psychology, clinical. There are ethical codes that clinicians, practitioners have to abide with, but there are also codes that researchers at universities have to abide by. And in fact, the federal government requires that we abide with these ethical codes. This applies to anyone doing psychology research, even undergraduates doing an undergraduate psychology project. So, the main issue of this is that all research must be approved by an appropriate ethics committee. And that committee must include people that are not involved in the research. Very often includes someone from outside the college. At the very least, it would include professors from other departments. At Mary Baldwin College, this is the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. And so everyone, including psychology senior thesis students, any professor who wants to do a research project, any master's student in education, any Murphy-Deming student who's doing any physical therapy or occupational therapy research, has to take their proposal to this committee. And it is a very serious offense to collect any research data without IRB approval. In fact, that can get a professor fired. It can get a student kicked out of school. It's a very serious offense. So, what are the components of an ethical study? Well, probably the most important is this concept of what we call informed consent. This means the person has to be aware of what they're being asked to do and agree to it. Now, this is a legally binding document, or legal consent, which means the person has to be of legal age. They have to be over 21. It's for this reason that we cannot allow PEGS, Early College Academy students who are under 18 to participate in most studies, because you're not old enough to give consent for yourself. Now, there are some occasions where we would arrange to get permission from an underage student's parents, but the fact is time constraints usually don't allow for that. So most of our studies cannot involve students under 18. If you are involving minor children in your study, you have to get consent from the parent. The person has to be informed, which means they have to be given information about what they're being asked to do. So you have to let them know what will be expected of them. You're going to have to take a math test. You're going to be given a memory test. You're going to be asked to walk on a treadmill so we can take your blood pressure. That type of stuff, whatever the experiment involved. They must be informed of any risks, and particularly if there's any risk for physical or emotional stress. For instance, one common thing to do is to try to induce a particular mood by showing a movie clip. So if the movie clip is violent or sexual in nature, comes from an R-rated movie or something, you let the person know that ahead of time, that you may be asked to watch a sexually explicit scene from an R-rated movie as part of the study. And then people who were not comfortable with that would have the option, of course, of saying, no, I prefer not to do this. Now, of course, there is some issue with this. You can't just reveal everything. Sometimes telling your research participant what this experiment is about is going to influence the results. One example, several years ago, a student wanted to do a study on the degree to which people make eye contact when they're having a normal conversation. Well, if she sat down with a person and said, okay, I'm going to have a conversation with you and record how much you are making eye contact with me, so just act natural. Well, because she knows her eye contact is going to be recorded, her eye contact may very well be different than if she didn't know what was going on. So, how do you give informed consent when you, in fact, can't tell the person always what you're looking for or what you're going to be measuring? Well, typically what the solution is, the participant's going to be given a consent form that tells them what they will be asked to do. So the students in this study several years ago about eye contact were told, I'm going to interview you about your activities on campus. That's what they were talking about. And so that's what they were told. They were told they were going to be asked to tell the experimenter about their extracurricular activities, and but they weren't told that eye contact was going to be measured. And very often what you have is a disclaimer on the consent form that says the full purpose of this study cannot be explained at this time. Just so the person is aware that they're not being told everything. But typically then, after the experiment is over, you do what is referred to as debriefing. And you tell the person then, usually, what you were measuring. By the way, if you are working with children, and some of our students do that, they manage to get permission to go into the schools or something and test children. Parents, of course, have to sign the consent form, but children actually have to give what they refer to as assent. The child has to agree to the study as well. So you explain to the extent that they're able to. Obviously, infants can't do this, but even a child, basically any child who's verbal, you can say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Is this okay with you? And if they, for very young children, you just get verbal assent. You just get them to say, yes, I want to do this. This is fun. Or if the child can read and write, you very often give them a age-appropriate description of what's going on in writing and go ahead and have them sign it, even if they're, only 8-10 years old. So even if the parent has said, yes, let's do this experiment, if you have a child who does not want to, who is crying and scared and wants to go home, you have to stop the experiment and not continue with it, which is best anyway. You're not going to get good data from a child who is upset or scared anyway. So that is the basics of informed consent. So typically, a research participant would have to sign this consent form, and then both they and the researcher would keep a copy. So there's a record of what they agreed to do. The consent form also usually has information about, well, it usually has contact information for the IRB itself, and contact information, if it's a student project, from the student's faculty advisor, so that the participant, if they have any questions, if they have any concern, they know who to contact. That's also part of the consent form. Okay, what about deception? Can researchers deceive participants? Well, the answer is yes, under some circumstances. And there are kind of two ways of deceiving a participant. One is sort of the lie of omission, not telling them the full purpose. So telling you, I'm going to be talking to you about your extracurricular activities when you're in fact going to be measuring eye contact. That is kind of a lie of omission. It's keeping the full purpose from the participant. There's a little bit more extreme form of deception, which is active deception. That's actually misleading them, making them believe something that is not true, either explicitly or implicitly. So, for example, if you're doing a study, say, on academic self-confidence, if you give them a math test and they score an 85 and you tell them they made a 60 to put them in a low confidence condition, that would be, active deception. Use of a confederate. A confederate is someone who they think is either a bystander or perhaps another participant in the study, but is someone who is actually working with the researcher, is actually creating parts of the conditions for the experiment. Just an example of that. A number of years ago, a student was doing a study on distractions in class. So they had a group of students, they were coming in, they were doing just a basic vocabulary test, or they were reading a chapter and then taking a test on it, doing some sort of academic exercise. And they had a confederate in the room acting like she was doing the test along with the students, but this was actually someone who was there to create a distraction. So she was clicking her pen and pulling out a bag of potato chips and opening it and crunching the potato chips very loudly, and sniffling and coughing and just making a lot of disruptive noises. And so the purpose of this, of course, was to see if the people who were in the presence of this distractor did worse on this academic exercise. Certainly a very interesting question. But of course, while this was going on, the participants were being deceived. They thought this was another person, a peer of theirs, doing the experiment along with them, and they probably thought she was being very rude. So that could have caused them, of course, if they knew this person, to think poorly of them. That is an act of deception. Secretly observing or recording them. This is something that had to be done for that eye contact study. Obviously, it's very hard to record eye contact when you are talking to someone. So what was going on in this study is that they were in a room. There was a one-way mirror, so something that looked like a window or a mirror, but another observer was actually watching the conversation secretly and keeping track of how often the person being interviewed made eye contact with the interviewer. So that was, the person did not know that they were being observed by another party. There are other types of studies where you might need to film someone while they're waiting for something, or you want to, for whatever reason, know what the person is doing when they think they're alone. Obviously, that would involve recording them without their knowledge. There can be some sort of staging of a scene, letting them to believe something is happening, pulling a fire alarm in the middle of a study, for instance, to look at the effects of that type of disruption. There was a study one of my colleagues was in as an undergraduate where they were led to believe they were doing a study on the computers, and computers were relatively new tools in those days. Tells you how old this study is. But they were led to believe that they had done something that had caused the computer to crash. And that was the stress-inducing aspect of this study that they were trying to manipulate. So they were led to think they had broken a very expensive piece of computer equipment. So all of these are examples of deceptions. Now, this is something that the IRB looks at very closely. So it's very important for the IRB to approve any type of deception. And in order to get your deception approved, your researcher must show that it's essential. You can't do the study without it. That the deception is not likely to do long-term harm. And that, and that they will be debriefed, or the deception will be cleared up as soon as possible after your data is collection. So imagine, for instance, let's say you're going back to that issue of competence in math. If you let the person leave the study thinking they had scored horribly on this very basic arithmetic class, that could undermine their competence and could affect their decisions about taking future math classes or various things like that. So you would have to, after you've done your data collection, explain to them, hey, you really did not do as badly as we told you did, and tell them their actual score, tell them realistically. You'd have to explain to them, okay, you really didn't break the computer, or this person who was behaving so rudely while you were taking your test, she was actually working with me, and that was part of the study. Okay. Now the good news is most participants understand that this deception is part of the research process, and they understand that, and they, after the fact, they don't mind being deceived. But again, it's very important that that approval be given to produce, to keep anyone from being deceived in the long term or for longer than is necessary to conduct the study. The final issue, privacy concerns. Participants' privacy typically has to be protected in these types of studies. There are psychologists who would like to look at some very interesting aspects of the human experience, but sometimes this information is sensitive, potentially stigmatizing. If, say, you are interested in sexual behaviors, illicit drug use, alcohol use, academic dishonesty, honesty, lying, anything like that. Some obviously fascinating topics that we're very interested in studying in many cases, but it does involve collecting information that could damage, harm, or embarrass somebody if it became widely known outside the research. So what do you do if you want to collect this data that is going to give you information that is potentially stigmatizing, including even things like illegal activities? Well, usually the solution is that, if possible, you collect the data anonymously. So you cannot connect a name to the information. Now, this usually means using the survey method of data collection. Obviously, you have to collect it at a distance. Now, this has gotten much easier in recent years. It used to be you'd have to send out papers and then collect them and make sure they had no names and disguise them with codes if you're giving the test or the survey in person. in this day and age, most of it is going to be done, or it's very often going to be done by computer, using a computer program with privacy protections built in. Mary Baldwin actually uses this particular system called Qualtrics. It's a company we have a contract with, where the company is responsible for, disguising the information, concealing the information so you can't tell where it's coming from. And Qualtrics meets HIPAA standards. HIPAA is the law that protects a person's medical information and prevents a doctor, for instance, from releasing medical information about a person, except under certain circumstances, like they can release it to the insurance company, they can release it to law enforcement if the law enforcement people have a warrant for it, but they can't just, tell your neighbor, oh, I'm treating her for cancer, or I'm treating her for depression, or I'm treating her for alcohol abuse. All right, that would be a violation of the law, and that could cost them their medical license. So Qualtrics meets HIPAA standards, which means there is essentially no way of connecting information to an individual. And so that pretty much takes care of sensitive, stigmatizing information and allows you to ask things that you might not be able to ask in person. Now keep in mind, this can be, just to give you an example, I have a former colleague who, as a graduate student, did a study on date rape at the university she was teaching at, or working at, getting her degree at. So she sent out a surveyed about several hundred men on campus. And one of the questions on there was, have you ever used a gun or a knife to force a woman to have sex with you? Well, of the 100 or so surveys she got back, I think 2 of them had written yes to that question. Well, that is very stigmatizing information. If that became known, that would be, that's confessing basically to a very serious crime that could get them a very lengthy prison term. So if she had been able to connect a name to that, she probably would have been obliged to report it to law enforcement, or to the university under Title IX or something like that. Because it was anonymous, she did not have that responsibility. And it basically took that pressure off of her. And it gave us some important information about rape on campus. All right, if 2 out of 200 people admit to doing this, that's something that's worth knowing. Okay, so if for some reason your data is not anonymous, for instance, you're doing in-person interviews, as you might have to do if you were interviewing children, or perhaps talking about something, perhaps doing something like the eye contact research that we were talking about. And there's a reasonable chance that stigmatizing or sensitive information could come up. The consent form has to include some statement on under what circumstances the researcher would break confidentiality and who else would have access to this information. For instance, if it's a student project, does the professor who is sponsoring the project have access to this information? You can imagine if you were being interviewed about academic dishonesty, if you've ever committed a violation of the honor code, the student might say, okay, I'll keep this confidential, but if the professor has access to that data, that obviously could have a long-term implications for your career at Mary Baldwin College. Even if the professor doesn't turn you into the honor council, if you wind up in that professor's class a year later and she knows that you are a habitual cheater, that's going to affect your relationship. So you have to let them know who's going to have access to this information and under what circumstance you could break confidentiality. Now, typically, confidentiality is taken very seriously and has to be maintained. Basically, information that is collected as part of a psychology study is kept confidential, just like any other academic exercise, just like your grades would be, everything like that. Um, but there are circumstances where it might have to be broken if there was a risk of harm to self or another. So, for instance, if you were administering a inventory, a test for depression, and a person indicated that they were suicidal, that is something, if you, again, if you know the person who has said this, a student would be told to report that information to her faculty advisor, and the faculty advisor would, if they thought it was a serious threat of suicide, would report that to the appropriate college officials and try to get student help. If you're interviewing a child and for some reason the child discloses abuse, or if you're interviewing and they disclose that they have been sexually assaulted, there are some obligations to report that. Again, under rules like Title IX and other mandatory reporting rules. But generally, that's not going to happen. In fact, I don't think I've ever had it happen in 16 years of doing research here. But, you know, keep that in mind that if data is, if there is any indication that a person is in danger, sometimes confidentiality has to be broken. But again, usually those types of topics don't come up in in-person data collection. What about animals? Obviously, people do some psychological research with animals, as well as other types of biomedical research involving animals, drug testing, that type of things. Basically, research on animals in psychology is regulated under the same rules that any other type of biomedical research involving animals is, which means, again, there are lots of regulations in place, and these typically are federal laws, including but not limited to the Animal Welfare Act, which is the national law that protects animals from abuse. So in order to keep animals in a research facility, you have to have a license from the USDA. If you have a license from the USDA, you're subject to unannounced inspections. So if I have mice or something in my laboratory, I have the USDA inspector can show up any hour, any day, and say, I want to see your facility. And she would walk in there, she would make, if the animals were not being properly taken care of, the college and the researcher personally could be held criminally liable. So this is something that's taken very seriously. The animals have to be well taken care of. They have to have the right size cages and proper food and access to water and appropriate bedding. There's a whole book of regulations on how to take care of animals. As with humans, studies have to be approved by a committee, and at Mary Baldwin that's called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. That's IACUC, IACUC, sometimes we say IACUC. Your Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee has to have a specific makeup. It has to include at least one licensed veterinarian. It also has to include a member of the community, so someone from outside the college, and someone who is specifically an animal welfare advocate. So we actually have a woman who teaches an animal welfare course at JMU, who is our community member and also our animal welfare advocate. She's the one who, as she says, she's on the critter side. So what you have to do in order to do a study with animals, you have to demonstrate to the committee that, first of all, the research cannot be done without animals, that it is not possible to use a cell culture or a computer simulation or something like that. Given that psychologists are usually studying behavior, This is usually not too hard to demonstrate. Obviously, a culture of cells or a computer simulation is not going to behave the same as a live animal. You have to show that your research can contribute some new information and it's important enough to justify using animals. You have to show that you are using as few animals as possible to do the study, and that you're using the simplest animal model possible. So if you can use fruit flies, you use fruit flies and don't use mice. If you can use mice, you use mice and you don't use monkeys. So the end result of this is, as far as research on mammals, 90% of it nationwide is on either rats or mice. So that's usually the simplest animal model and the most common animal model, rats or mice. Less than 5% of animal research is on monkeys, dogs, cats, larger, what some people might call more intelligent animals like that. And here's something that's absolutely essential. You have to show either that they're not going to suffer any pain at all, or that any pain, stress, suffering that the animals might undergo is being reduced to the greatest extent possible. So, is it possible to reduce all suffering? Well, no. Some research is going to require, for instance, operating on the animal, doing surgery. That's how biomedical research works. So, but if you are doing surgery on the animal, first of all, you have to be trained in how to do it. But you have to use appropriate anesthesia, you have to use appropriate painkillers, and you have to do appropriate follow-up care. You have to, have the same animals that have to get proper veterinary care, just like a pet would if a pet was undergoing surgery. You have to have, of course, a vet consult. They are going to be responsible for training the researchers and overseeing the research. And if the experiment requires that the animals be euthanized at the end of it, the euthanization procedure has to be approved and, again, be as humane and painless as possible. So that is basically the regulations for animals. So as you can see, they're pretty stringent. It is a you have to do a lot to assure the safety of animals if you're going to work with them in a laboratory. All right, that is basically it for this segment. Thank you for your attention.